Allegedly, maybe, perhaps.
Okay, so charitable health foundations, changing the DNA of mosquitoes, you've probably worked out where I'm going with this. And that assumption would be correct. But this is not the main point. We're still just setting the scene. The chapter after this one is where it really starts to unravel, and even made me question my sanity, which is why I've made this video for you to be the judge. Anyway, back to the obvious. Starting with the history of mRNA vaccines. A lot of people think mRNA vaccines were some kind of miracle breakthrough that happened overnight during COVID. But here's what's really interesting. mRNA technology was actually discovered back in the early 1960s. Research into how to deliver mRNA into cells started in the 1970s. So why did it take until 2020, 50 years later, for the first mRNA vaccine to actually hit the market? Well, there's a massive gap in this story that's pretty eye-opening. The first mRNA flu vaccine was tested in mice back in the 1990s. Then we jump all the way to 2013 when the first mRNA vaccines for rabies were tested in humans. So what was happening during all those years in between? That's 2 decades of what exactly? The answer lies in some major technical challenges. The biggest problem was that the body would just destroy the mRNA before it could do its job. Think of it like trying to deliver a message, but the messenger gets intercepted before reaching its destination. Scientists needed to find a way to protect the mRNA long enough for it to get inside cells and start producing proteins. The breakthrough came from advances in nanotechnology, specifically something called lipid nanoparticles. Basically, they figured out how to wrap the mRNA in tiny fat bubbles, kind of like a protective envelope that could sneak past the body's defenses and deliver the genetic instructions directly into cells. Once they solved this delivery problem, the first mRNA vaccines using these fatty envelopes were actually developed against Ebola. But here's the catch. Since Ebola outbreaks are mostly limited to certain African countries, there wasn't much commercial interest from U.S. companies to develop it further. Now, in late 2019, COVID-19 first emerged in Wuhan, China, quickly spreading worldwide and triggering a global pandemic that would reshape life as we know it. Even today, scientists and governments are still arguing about whether the virus jumped naturally from animals to humans at a wet market, or whether it accidentally escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a lab that happened to be studying bat coronaviruses just miles away from where the outbreak began. But let's just leave that for now. Here's something else to consider instead. When Pfizer said their COVID vaccine was 95% effective, that number was technically true, but incredibly misleading. They were using something called relative risk reduction, which sounds impressive, but the absolute risk reduction tells a very different story. Let me break this down. In Pfizer's trial, they had about 36,000 people split into two groups. The unvaccinated group had 162 COVID cases, while the vaccinated group had only 8. That's where the 95% comes from. But here's the kicker. That means you'd need to vaccinate 119 people to prevent just one case of COVID. The actual absolute benefit was less than 1%. It's like saying a lottery ticket is 100% more likely to win than another ticket, when both have a 0.0000001% chance of winning. What makes this even more concerning is that in 2025, UK regulators actually found Pfizer in breach for promoting these misleading 95% efficacy claims on social media, without mentioning the much smaller absolute benefits or the safety information. So the very numbers that convinced millions to get vaccinated were presented in the most flattering way possible, while hiding the full picture. Now, let's shift gears slightly. Back in 2014, the Ebola crisis in West Africa was devastating. It spread across borders, killed thousands, and exposed a massive problem. When a pandemic hits the world's poorest countries, getting money to fight it is painfully slow. The World Bank looked at that and thought, we need a better system. So in 2016, they created something called the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility. Basically, a pot of money ready to go when disaster strikes. And to fund part of it, they came up with something pretty radical: pandemic bonds. Here's how they worked. Private investors bought these bonds, and in return, they got really generous annual payouts. We're talking 6.5% to over 11%, above the standard rate, depending on the risk level. That's a seriously good deal. But there was a catch. If a real pandemic hit and met certain specific criteria, investors would lose some or all of their money, and that cash would go straight to developing countries to fight the outbreak. Think of it like this. Investors were essentially betting that a major pandemic wouldn't happen before the bonds expired. And guess when the bonds expired? July 2020. If nothing happened, they'd walk away with a nice profit. If something did happen, well, you know where this is going. Now, the payout wasn't automatic. There were strict conditions, a minimum number of cases and deaths. The outbreak had to be spreading across borders, and it had to be getting worse over time. All of that had to be independently verified. By April 2020, all those boxes were checked, and roughly $195 million was released to 64 of the world's poorest countries. Each one got between $1 and $15 million for things like medical equipment, drugs, and transportation. It was a first-of-its-kind experiment in using financial markets to fight pandemics. Now, with all of that in mind, the mRNA history, the vaccine numbers, and the pandemic bonds, let's see what we can find when we follow the money. We're going to introduce a new character, someone I'm not going to give a proper introduction. Let's have a look at what's in Redacted Jeff's inbox. First up, January 2010. Redacted. Jeff sends an email to Eva Dubin. Nothing unusual about that on the surface. But the content, it's a detailed explanation of how amino acids are encoded by codons, how mutations in genetic sequencing work, and how changes can be undetectable without sequencing the gene, or its mRNA. Next, February 2011. Redacted Jeff emails Jess Staley, who at the time was a senior executive at J.P. Morgan. He's laying out a blueprint for what he describes as a donor-advised fund tied to the Gates program with a minimum gift of $100 million. He says, done right, it's $100 billion in 2 years. And then he writes something very telling. He says the tension is making money from a charitable organization, and therefore the money-making parts need to be at arm's length. He's literally spelling out how to profit from philanthropy while keeping it looking clean. Then, in July 2011, Redacted Jeff receives a formal invitation to visit the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So despite everything, he's being welcomed through the front door. Fast forward to August 2011, and Redacted Jeff is now emailing Mary Erdoes at J.P. Morgan, with Jess Staley copied in. He's answering questions about this charitable fund structure, and one line jumps out. He says they should be ready with an offshore arm, especially for vaccines. An offshore arm, especially for vaccines, in 2011. And in the same thread, Erdos is asking what role the Gates Foundation will play in terms of marketing, R&D, grant making, and investments. This isn't casual conversation. This is operational planning. April 2014. Redacted Jeff is emailing Richard Henriquez about a donor vehicle. The reply lays out key objectives for a new entity tied to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It describes creating a private donor vehicle to attract substantial sums with maximum tax efficiency and with Bill and Melinda as controlling members. February 2015. Author Michael Wolff. Emails. Redacted. Jeff directly describing how Bill Gates had been prodding. Redacted Jeff to begin a process of public rehabilitation, and that Redacted Jeff had been advising Gates on a new way to increase the clout of the Gates Foundation by bundling other charitable funds into the Gates operation. So, Redacted Jeff isn't just donating to Gates. He's advising him on how to structure and grow the foundation itself. March 2015. And this one really raises eyebrows. An email with the subject line, "Preparing for Pandemics," is forwarded to Redacted Jeff. It's originally from Walter Kemp, and it includes a draft agenda for a Geneva meeting on pandemic preparedness, along with a discussion about how to officially involve the WHO and the ICRC through co-branding. And Kemp signs off with, "I hope we can pull this off." This is 2015, 4 years before COVID. May 2017, Boris Nikolic, who was Bill Gates' science advisor, emails both Redacted Jeff and Gates directly. He suggests that a donor-advised fund would be a great path forward for key areas such as energy and, his word, pandemic. Nikolic, Gates, and Redacted Jeff, all on the same email thread discussing pandemic funding in 2017. And then there's a text message chain from January 2017 that mentions joining the Swiss reinsurance team that was developing health products, specifically one for pandemics, and that this person helped develop the parametric trigger. Parametric triggers are a mechanism that determined whether the conditions for a pandemic had been met, and thus the World Bank's pandemic bonds would pay out. Finally, there's a document Redacted Jeff emailed to himself in October 2016, essentially a profile piece describing his world. It paints a picture of billionaires, tech founders, and world leaders all gathering at Redacted Jeff's home. Google founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin literally running across his private plane on the tarmac. And the key detail, it describes Bill Gates as one of Redacted Jeff's frequent guests, with Redacted Jeff proposing ways to leverage the Gates Foundation to bundle 10 or 20 billionaires into one giving project. And here's the thing. Across all the released files, the Gates Foundation is mentioned over 670 times in documents dated before 2020. 670 times. Now, quick side note. I'll keep it brief. One of the names that keeps popping up in Redacted Jeff's inbox is a Harvard professor called Martin Nowak. Nowak is a world-renowned expert in, and this is the bit that matters, virus dynamics. The mathematics of how viruses spread, how they evolve, how they develop resistance. He literally wrote the textbook on it. Between 1998 and 2008, Redacted Jeff poured $6.5 million into Nowak's lab, Harvard's program for evolutionary dynamics. When Redacted Jeff died, he left Nowak another $5 million. in his trust. That's over $11 million flowing from a convicted sex trafficker into a lab studying virus behavior and evolution. Now, have a look at these emails. In 2002, Nowak emailed Ghislaine Maxwell, yes, that Ghislaine Maxwell, thanking her for her amazing hospitality and writing, and I quote, "I am so happy that I did not kill anybody. My perspective of life has changed somehow. Lots of love, Martin."
Damn!
Make of that what you will. Then in 2014, Nowak emails Redacted Jeff saying, "Our spy was captured after completing her mission." Redacted Jeff's reply, "Did you torture her?" Now, some people have suggested this was just dark humor between friends. Maybe. But it's not exactly normal, is it? In 2021, Harvard had finally sanctioned Nowak, shut down his program, and stripped most of his privileges, all because of the Redacted Jeff connection. And here's where it ties back to our story. In February 2022, right in the thick of the pandemic, Nowak co-authored a paper in Nature Human Behavior on, wait for it, the evolution of resistance to COVID-19 vaccination. The very thing his Redacted Jeff-funded research had been building towards for over a decade. Back to Mr. Gates. In October 2019, just weeks before COVID emerged, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, the World Economic Forum, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation co-hosted a high-level pandemic simulation called Event 201. The scenario? A novel coronavirus originating from bats passing through an intermediate animal host and spreading rapidly across the globe, causing a devastating pandemic. The exercise brought together leaders from governments, global health organizations, and the private sector to wargame their response to this fictional outbreak. They discussed everything from how to manage overwhelmed healthcare systems to how governments and tech companies should handle misinformation on social media. Now, the organizers have been very clear that this was not a prediction. It was a preparedness exercise. And to be fair, health experts had been warning about a coronavirus pandemic for years. But you have to admit, the timing and the details are striking. A simulation about a global coronavirus pandemic, partly funded by the Gates Foundation just weeks before a global coronavirus pandemic actually begins. Anyway, as we know, just a few weeks or months later, the real event happened. The parametric triggers were met, and the pandemic was declared. The world was locked down, then vaccines were rolled out. Now, a quick side note. Remember that Redacted Jeff took his own life in very suspicious circumstances on August 10th, 2019. 2 years later, in August 2021, while still in the depths of the pandemic, Melinda French Gates divorced Bill. Let's hear from Melinda.
I also met Jeffrey Epstein exactly one time.
Did you?
Yes, because I wanted to see who this man was. And I regretted it from the second I stepped in the door. He was abhorrent. He was evil personified. I had nightmares about it afterward.
Why the fuck would you go to that island?
During the COVID-19 pandemic, something unprecedented happened with global wealth. While most people around the world struggled with job losses, pay cuts, and growing uncertainty, the fortunes of the super rich skyrocketed. In fact, we witnessed the biggest wealth transfer in human history. The wealth of the world's 10 richest men did more than just grow. It more than doubled. These fortunes soared from an already staggering $700 billion to an astronomical $1.5 trillion in just the first 2 years of the pandemic. While billions worried about paying rent or just putting food on the table, the wealthiest few multiplied their fortunes at a jaw-dropping pace. This wasn't just a story about numbers. It was about how the rules of the global economy seemed to bend in favor of the top fraction of society, while the middle class and poor communities bore the brunt of the crisis. For the majority, the pandemic meant economic hardship and fresh uncertainty. Inequality grew wider than ever, as opportunities and safety nets proved out of reach for many. Meanwhile, the super-rich turned crisis into opportunity, benefiting from stock market booms, powerful tech monopolies, and a financial system that rewarded those already at the top.
It was reported that you continued to meet with him over several years, and that, in other words, a number of meetings. What did you do when you found out about his background?
Well, I've said I regretted having those dinners, and there's absolutely nothing new on that.
Is there a lesson for you, for anyone else looking at this?
Well, he's dead, so in general, you always have to be careful. And I'm very proud of